So thank you all so much for joining us today. We are going to have a fantastic conversation here about civil disobedience in the drug policy movement. My name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And we are a 501c3 organization that seeks to empower young people to change the drug laws in their community. And we are joined by two fantastic activists, Steve D'Angelo, one of the founders of the Last Prisoner Project, and Chris Furnish, who is one of the founders and organizers with DC and Maryland Marijuana Justice. And so we're going to talk a bit about the historical context for civil disobedience, some of the work that's been coming up more recently, and then of course our action that's going to be coming up on October 24th. And so just to put it all out there, we decided to join together SSDP, the Last Prisoner Project, and lots of other allies like DC Marijuana Justice to pressure President Biden to release federal cannabis prisoners using his pardon authority. And so we will be organizing across the country and invite other folks to join us in that organizing to pressure both President Biden himself and all of the Democrats and elected officials in the country to use their authority and their platforms to make sure that Joe Biden releases cannabis prisoners as soon as possible, meaning immediately. He definitely has the ability to do so. He has been working on it, he says, for a long time. And so now we're here to up the urgency a bit of this demand and explain how folks around the country can use civil disobedience and direct action to get the job done. One of the quick things, just want to make sure everybody knows about SSDP. We specifically mobilize young folks to change drug laws in their communities. We do cover all drugs, including cannabis, psychedelics, and other more stigmatized drugs, and specifically things that target and laws that target youth and students. And so we grow the movement by bringing the industry together with leaders in coaching and training and experiential education for our students, reforming drug policy all the way from a campus to a city council, to a state law, to a federal bill, to international work that we do with our international partners. We also educate folks on using drugs safely and making sure that they all have plenty of opportunities to speak truth to their elected officials, which of course, this is going to be one of those opportunities. Now, I wanted to put some historical context on civil disobedience because we're going to have a mix of experience levels that are going to be participating both today, but also in the future, and want to make sure folks knew that civil disobedience is something that is part of a long history of social change. It's not something that, is new. It's something that's been used for a very long time. And maybe one of the most ancient ways of social change is disobeying what the rules you think do not make sense. And so to be very clear, civil disobedience is the active professed refusal of a citizen to obey certain laws, demands, orders, or commands of a government. By some definitions, civil disobedience has to be nonviolent to be called civil. Hence, civil disobedience is sometimes equated with peaceful protest or nonviolent resistance. And especially in the United States, but across the world, there's a long history of nonviolent resistance. And we're going to go over a few of those, just so that way everybody has some context for the long lineage of activism that we're all continuing with this protest and this action. So I couldn't start this conversation without mentioning, the grandfather and one of the folks that has clearly throughout history used nonviolent civil disobedience most effectively, and that is Mahatma Gandhi. In the early half of the early 1900s, as many folks know, the British had occupied and colonized India, and Mahatma Gandhi was one of the folks that mobilized the people to resist this colonialism through one particular action, although it was many over the course of the campaign, with the Salt March. And it was a march by Gandhi and his followers to reject the rules that native Indians were not allowed to collect salt from the salt water. And so that was a rule because the British wanted to control salt production, and Gandhi led his people on a march across India to gather supporters to go to the oceans and actually collect water in violation of the law. One of the most important parts of this was focusing on truth and love as the focus for the actions, and shining truth onto scenes of injustice that needed to be brought to light. And so this was one example of that rule. It was a pivotal moment where, when they were disrupted by the police, that did inflame the resistance movement and the resilience movement to grow across the country. And it actually inspired many of the other leaders of our generations, like MLK and Nelson Mandela, in their struggles across the world. Here in the United States, back when the suffragettes were organizing around getting the right to vote, it was definitely used aggressively, where the suffragettes would actually chain themselves to the White House gates to bring awareness of the fact that they were not given right to vote. And there was some very intense clashes with police. Folks were imprisoned, but the actions done by the suffragettes did lead to widespread national attention on the issue. And eventually those protests and arrests did lead to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted the right to vote. And so as early as the early 1900s, even here in the United States, nonviolent civil disobedience has been used to gain very clear, serious material gains for our people. Another one that I'm sure folks are pretty well aware of is the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro here in the States. This was during the 1960s when we were fighting Jim Crow laws. Specifically, this law said that Black folks cannot sit at the same lunch counter as white folks. There were a number of folks who sat down at Greensboro, Alabama storefront. And when the police came to disrupt it, they also had a lot of press there, and it became a national sensation that within a few days grew to hundreds of students doing sit-ins and lunch counter sit-ins around the country that led to an increase massively in support for the civil rights movement and specifically around ending Jim Crow laws. And so it was the combined efforts of Black organizers throughout the South with the support of students that really brought this movement to the next level and was able to then reach out to not just lunch counters, but also libraries, beaches, hotels, and pretty much everywhere in the country where there were Jim Crow laws. Folks would disobey those laws by communicating and eating together or drinking together or having dinner together to show that the law itself was not something that they felt was just and would violate it until the law was changed. Specifically, though, cannabis also has a long history of civil disobedience, and quite frankly, just about all of the cultivation that is happening, the entire cannabis industry itself, and a lot of our actions of sharing cannabis with others are an act of civil disobedience. But specifically, the movement around the LGBTQ community addressing the need for medical marijuana for those that were suffering from AIDS was a huge momentum push for the efforts to legalize more generally. But in the West Coast and the folks that are really mobilizing for access to medical marijuana, they were very publicly and very deliberately disobeying the laws around whether they could access medical marijuana or not. And this led to a huge shift in understanding and public perception around why medical marijuana would benefit certain communities. It was undeniable that the cannabis plant would benefit those who were suffering from that illness, and the refusal for the advocates in resisting the war on drugs and the laws that were preventing access, definitely pushed not just medical marijuana forward, but legalization of cannabis in general in a really big way. And then more recently, some of the folks that are younger folks that are on the call may recognize the Sunrise Movement did a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office that gathered the attention of then first-time Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and this elevated the climate movement to new heights and got incredible attention on the idea of the Green New Deal. And so the idea of a sit-in in an elected official's office has been a tried and true effort and tactic to gather attention for a particular issue. And this is one that happened not too long ago, a few years ago, to really push for climate justice in the United States. So students, again, have been a part of this process from the very beginning, and just about every movement for justice, students have had a part to play in that. And we want to make sure that in this context, we understand that the work we're doing here today to free cannabis prisoners is, again, part of this long lineage of amazing actions that have brought real justice and real progress for our nation. And so just a couple examples of different types of civil disobedience, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk with Steve and Chris about the actual specifics of the actions. And so if folks have any other questions about types of actions or anything else, feel free to use the Q&A. We will get to as many of those questions as we can towards the end of the forum. But things like student walkouts, that was something that happened recently when there was a lack of action on unfortunate gun violence in our school systems. There were many students that did walkouts to protest a lack of action from their governments, sit-ins, product boycotts, or various types of boycotts. We've seen that happen in the farm workers movement with boycotting grapes, and then we may someday see it here in the United States when it comes to the cannabis industry and folks that don't support equity and justice for our movements. Boycotting products is definitely something that has been done and effectively done in the past. occupations. And so similar like we saw the sit-in with Nancy Pelosi's office, but things like Occupy Wall Street that were occupying whole sectors, whole areas, and liberating them for our use. Students have done occupations in president's office, et cetera. And then lastly, one of the more intense types of civil disobedience is a hunger strike. We've definitely seen folks that have been incarcerated or in really serious situations of oppression utilize hunger strikes to draw attention to their particular issue, where folks refuse to eat until their friends or families are free from jail or some other political purpose. But I do also just want to remind everybody that our entire gifting economy, our growing economy, when we share cannabis with other folks, that is civil disobedience. And so we are already part of the long line of work that has been done so far to really get us there. And the big point that I want to share with everybody is that civil disobedience is getting into good trouble, right? Yes, you're getting into trouble, you're defying a law, but you're doing so for reasons that are going to benefit society and actually move us forward as a nation. And so I encourage everyone to get excited to join us in DC on October 24th to get in some good trouble with us. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Steve D'Angelo, who is a longtime activist in the cannabis justice movement from the West Coast, one of the founders of the Last Prisoner Project. He's done incredible work in the industry to try to make sure we have folks that are actually seeking equity and justice in the space have that opportunity, and has had some very fascinating and unfortunate incidences with law enforcement over the years. But I'll kick it over to Steve to give us his full story, his background, and a little bit about why you're deciding to join us on October 24th to get in some good trouble.
Well, thanks, Jason. That was just a really remarkable survey of the role of civil disobedience in American protest movements. And, it just, the list goes on and on. You mentioned John Lewis, and of course, the famous March Across the Bridge in Selma was an act of civil disobedience. Rosa Parks standing up was an act of civil disobedience. We just see it all through American history. Interestingly, my very first cannabis demonstration was also the very first Washington, D.C. July 4th smoking in 1971, which I just stumbled onto because I was a teenager going downtown to take some psychedelics and watch the fireworks. I didn't even know that the demonstration was going to be happening until I stumbled upon it. 4 years later, I had grown to becoming the lead organizer of that 4th of July smoking, which over the years grew to, at its peak, about 30 or 35,000 people gathering in Peace Park across the street from the White House and publicly smoking cannabis. That demonstration goes on to this day. It's waxed and waned over the years. But it's interesting to me because in the very earliest days of the cannabis freedom movement, before we had friendly legislators, before we had enough public support to do things like put initiatives on the ballot, when we had very limited toolkit to work with, civil disobedience was really the first tool that we went for. As far as I know, the very first demonstration to legalize cannabis in modern history was when Allen Ginsberg lit up a joint outside the New York City welfare office in 1967. A photograph of that demonstration is one of the things that inspired me as I was growing into activism. But over the years, our movement has matured, and we've grown in public support. We have an ability now to put initiatives on the ballot. We have the ability to build enough political support that we have elected officials who are allies. We have an ability to get them to sponsor legislation and move legislation. We have a lot more tools in our toolkit than we used to. And from my point of view, we have underutilized the tool of civil disobedience. And when I look at the political arena, I think that civil disobedience is really well suited at the beginning of movements, like it was for our cannabis freedom movement. I think it's also particularly well suited at certain junctures in the political process. And we are at one of those junctures now. President Biden, when he made an explicit promise to release cannabis prisoners, once during a nationally televised debate, and second time when he came back from his European tour. And this was, from my point of view, really a golden political opportunity for our movement. I doubted from the beginning that he made those statements, that he would actually come through on them. But he made them so explicitly that now we have an opportunity to shine a spotlight on the gap between the promise that he made and his failure to act on that promise and fulfill it. And historically, we've seen this pattern with the Democrats in our movement for as long as I can remember. When we were in the lead up to a general election, the Democrats were our best friends. They're going to legalize cannabis. Yeah, come into our offices, talk to us. We're with you guys, right? Then they get elected, and you go back to them. They were friendly to you the week before, and they're like, Steve, it's the first 100 days of the administration. We really have to focus on the president's top priorities now. But as soon as we get past the 100 days, we're going to take care of you. Don't worry, just hang on and be patient, right? So you hang on and you be patient. And then you go back to them at 200 days. And they're like, well, Steve, we really still support you, but, we're facing a difficult midterm challenge. And the president really needs to build as much support as he can. So could you just wait a little bit longer and wait till after the midterms? And then we're going to take care of this. And then, of course, we're back to the general election again, and nothing has happened. So I saw the same thing happening this time around, where Biden and Harris made these very explicit promises to help us, and now have done nothing to come through and fulfill those promises. And as we are heading into the midterms, I felt that it was really incumbent on our movement to hold him to account. Our movement is strong enough and mature enough now so that when a politician makes an explicit promise like that to us and fails entirely to come through on it, we have the ability, and I believe we have the duty, to hold their feet to the fire until you smell the skin burning.
Mic drop on that one. I like it. That was some of the framing I was using at NCF. Everything that man has built can burn. And so we can use the power of fire to draw attention to whatever we want, right? And I think you're right on, right? This is definitely the right moment for this. The folks that I've talked to about this have been incredibly supportive and inspired. It's long overdue. And so there's clearly support in the public for it. But now we're going to turn a little bit to some more modern examples of action in DC specifically. And we're going to kick it over to Chris Furnish. And so Chris is an organizer with DC and Maryland Marijuana Justice, has participated in civil disobedience herself, and has a long history and story about why she is personally invested in making sure that Joe Biden follows through on his promise to release cannabis prisoners. But Chris, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your story, and where we can, join in on your particular inspiration of why you're doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. So my name's Chris. I'm originally from Central Florida, and I've been smoking cannabis for most of my life. And I chose to move to Colorado because after 2016's election, or actually before that, the first time we voted on medical in Florida and it did not pass, even though it got a majority vote, I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. Like, I don't feel safe. I'm not going to stop smoking cannabis. So I literally moved to Colorado to be in a place where I felt I could consume and not fear, always looking over my shoulder. And it was an amazing experience, like the best 3 years of my cannabis life. And after that, one day I was watching Netflix and I discovered this documentary that went over everything about DC and how they legalized. And my colleague Adam Eidinger was interviewed, and I was just completely inspired by all the activism and all the things that they'd accomplished, and being the first place on the East Coast to legalize cannabis. And so when I reached out to them, they were getting ready to rent a house in Maryland on the Eastern Shore in Salisbury, because for those of you who don't know, yes, it is legal in DC, to possess and cultivate cannabis. However, Maryland's first district's Congressman Andy Harris threw a budget rider in the DC law when they passed legalization, preventing them from moving forward with fully legalizing, meaning like we don't have any recreational shops here. So after years and years of DCMJ members trying to meet with Harris, doing protests and demonstrations, the next plan of action was to rent this house in Salisbury, move to his district and vote him out. So that's what we did. You know, we did a lot of campaigning. This was the first time I'd ever worked on any kind of political work ever. You know, I'd never knocked on doors before. I certainly had never been arrested for civil disobedience. So, you know, this was kind of my foot into the door. And I just learned so much from that. Like, and I heard from so many folks how the drug war had impacted their lives in Maryland, and having a congressman in the district that just was completely against legalization. I mean, he's a doctor. He gets a lot of campaign contributions from the pharmaceutical company. This guy is just a tyrant. And so we worked really hard getting him out. And like I said, it was just really inspiring meeting all the residents. And during that time, my best friend AJ, who lives in Colorado, came down to Salisbury to help us with the campaign. And I need to say, you know, let you guys know, AJ is a Black man. I'm a white woman. And one night, after a long day of campaigning, we went to go grab some food and I got pulled over. And I feel that I was targeted, having Colorado tags, having marijuana stickers all over, you know, the trunk of my car, things like that. And, you know, AJ just being a Black man with dreadlocks. And they just used that as an excuse to pull me over with some bogus reason. They said I didn't stop at the white line on the stop sign, and that resulted in me watching the police, Salisbury Police Department, drag my best friend out of the passenger seat by anything they could grab, his hair, his arms, his legs, and just slam him on the ground, beat him up. And he had a panic attack. And I even admitted that the cannabis was mine to the police when it was happening, when he was in court, which is why they dropped the possession and paraphernalia charges. But they decided they were going to arrest my friend and let me, as a white woman, go home with a warning. And that's really what like opened my eyes to, like, we really have to do something. Like, this just happened to my best friend in front of my very eyes. I know this is happening all over the country right now. And I can't stand for it. And so I was inspired to start MDMJ as a sister group to DCMJ, because I felt Maryland was lacking an organization that was, you know, engaging in civil disobedience. We worked with Maryland Normal consecutively for like 3 years in a row, going up to Annapolis, lobbying the General Assembly, and not getting much results. So MDMJ was formed. We held protests outside of the police department and outside of the courthouse when my friend got arrested. And we just were really there to give people inspiration and show people, like, this is a different way to like get what we want. And shortly after that, we planned an action against Andy Harris at his congressional office in DC, which was the first time I'd engaged in civil disobedience and gotten arrested. You know, we went there expecting to have a meeting with him. He walked right past us in the hallways of the Longworth building and, you know, slammed the door in our face and literally slammed the door on my friend, the woman who I got arrested with. Her name's Rachel Ramon Donlin, and she suffers from a rare disease called Ehlers-Danlos. So she's, you know, she's like 90 pounds. She's a very tiny, fragile woman. And he slammed the door on her leg. And, you know, that was just nuts. So after that happened, we decided, well, we're not going to get a meeting with him. And we staged a die-in, which is similar to a sit-in, but we wanted to kind of get creative, knowing that Andy Harris is a doctor. We wanted to highlight the opioid crisis and, you know, just how many people have died from prescription medications and things like that. So we decided to lay down on the ground and act like we were dead. And after, I don't know, it's what seemed like forever, we decided to sit up, and we had joints in our Phrygian caps. We took the joints out of our hats and we lit them. And it was extremely successful action. We got a lot of press. They had to clear the entire floor of the building. It smelled like cannabis everywhere. I mean, there were cops everywhere, staffers everywhere. And I didn't realize till the next day, but we got a ton of press. Like every congressional news outlet on Capitol Hill had been writing about this. So, we were very successful in raising awareness. We've brought in the 50-foot joint out to Annapolis. I think that was like last year. And now look, we're going to get cannabis legalization on the ballot. So I feel like civil disobedience is a very strategic move to, like I said, get us forward to the end goal.
I agree wholeheartedly. I've participated in 6 different acts of civil disobedience now. Most of my experience was actually protesting the war in Iraq. And so I got a few different civil disobedience charges during the late 2000s, specifically trying to make sure that Congress didn't keep our troops there much longer than they had to be. Done some work on single payer universal health care, where we were actually protesting my Senator Lieberman at the time from Connecticut. He was blocking the public option. And so, we've definitely been in the trenches for a minute on lots of different issues. But I'll ask the first question, and then if folks do have additional questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. But I'm sure this is the question everybody gets whenever you're doing a civil disobedience or any kind of direct action. Why not just focus on voting? Why not focus on getting people out to vote, right? If there are folks that want to see folks come home from prison, isn't that the most effective way to have social change happen? And so we'll start with Steve and then Chris on this normal question of why not just help get more Democrats elected?
Well, because it hasn't worked. We did, despite my warnings to the movement that Harris and Biden had zero intention of following through on the promises, people in our movement overwhelmingly voted for Biden-Harris. And so we have voted. We voted for the ostensibly pro-cannabis, pro-release candidates. And we can't peer into their hearts and know exactly what's going on. But it's evident right now that because the White House has said so, that they do not intend to take any action on our issue before the midterms. So despite the fact that we voted for them, they're still not feeling enough political pressure to actually take action. And that's where the tool of civil disobedience comes in. Very frequently, civil disobedience is most effective, not when you're going up against somebody who's your absolute diehard opponent, but when you're going up against somebody who, at least in public, supports your goals, but just needs an extra push to do it. So in this case, we know that Biden very, very much wants the Senate to go into Democratic hands. And so we have an opportunity now to go to what he cares about most and apply pressure on that choke point. And that's the whole idea here, is to up the political pressure on Biden. So he just does what he said he was going to do, just get him to keep the promise that he already made.
Chris, why not just focus on getting more turnout in the elections?
Yeah, totally echoing what Steve has to say. Sometimes we elect leaders and they don't do what they promise. So this is our chance to hold them accountable, just like we're going to do in October. And politicians, they love to promise things to you. And then when they get voted in, they don't keep their promises. And they love to use issues that we care about to get you to the polls. So this is our opportunity in between an election that we can hold his feet to the fire and hold him responsible for the promises that he made. Because if people catch wind of this, he's not, I just want to say right now, I did not vote for Biden. I switched to Green Party before the November presidential election because I knew, Biden's got a long history of, not having, I would say, not caring about drug users and having no compassion. And I just didn't believe that he was going to change all of a sudden. I believe he used cannabis as a reason for people to vote for him. And, people voted for him, and now it's our time, to shout, like, you better keep your promise.
For sure, yeah. And I just see it as a yes and, right? It's vote and do everything else. And so it's not about not voting, right? And there's always going to be difficult decisions to make in the voting booth, who's going to support you and not. I was not a big Biden supporter, definitely a Sanders supporter, right? And so I knew going into this that we may be avoiding a catastrophe, but when it came to drug policy, we were definitely going to have our work cut out for us. And there was no way that it was going to happen just on its own accord, right? And we're seeing that happen again and again. But between November 5th or whatever November date it is, and the next November, there's 360 plus other days that we can be doing lots of other work. And I think Steve's point is particularly important in that civil disobedience works the best when you're working within your own set of allies or, folks that claim to be your allies. We're really trying to hold them to be honest in what they say that they're going to do and make sure they do it. And before an election, before midterms, is when we hold our politicians accountable for the promises they made. That's the exact moment that we want to make sure that they hear about it. And we let folks know if you don't actually follow through on your promises, there will be consequences, right? We've seen lots of other movements use this very effectively. They make it very clear they want what they want. And this is one of the things that I think the cannabis justice movement, in rare form for the cannabis justice movement, we all agree that we should let our federal cannabis prisoners, and most of our cannabis, not all, right, to come home that are currently incarcerated for cannabis crimes. So as the movement spends a lot of time on things like banking and licenses, we are losing our moral compass, I believe, internally. So part of it for me is also not just to tell Joe Biden that he needs to hold up to his promises, it's to tell our own movement we need to hold up to our promises, that we said we were going to do this work and get people home. And yes, legalization comes with financial benefits, but that was not the purpose of the movement for myself and for a lot of other folks in the space. And it is disheartening, right, to see so much energy and effort go into things that are relatively minor compared to getting folks out of prison where they are wasting away in jail for no reason whatsoever, other than we haven't provided the urgency to get them out. And so I think that is both, a call to action for elected officials and folks that make promises, but also our own spaces, right? And where we're at now, the business owners, the organizations that fought for it, my own folks in the equity movements, right? We've done a lot of work on licensing and policy and putting out papers, and we still have the vast majority of our cannabis prisoners remain in jail. Out of 19 states that legalize some form of recreational adult use cannabis, 0 released prisoners from prison when we passed it. 0. Not a single state did it, not even one, including my own state. And I'll 100% admit I failed to get that part into the policy. And it is something that's, because of that, I will forever make sure that we keep the focus on everything that we do on the criminal justice side of it. And, I want to make sure that our business folks hear, right, that this is important to your consumers, to your customers, to the movement leaders, and we're not going to let anybody off the hook on whether or not they're helping with this effort, right? And so before I forget, because I do want to give Steve a chance to talk a little bit about specifically what inspired you to found the Last Prisoner Project, right? Like, I think we share a lot of the sentiments around what we talk about, get folks out, but you actually took it a step forward, right? And actually founded an organization. Now that organization is partnering with SSDP so that we can do this fantastic work together. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about sort of what was the beginning of that and, how you, think folks can get involved and support your efforts moving forward.
Well, there was a long chain of experience, and then there was one single moment that really led me to found the Last Prisoner Project. The long chain of experience goes back to those 17 states that you're talking about, and of course, California was one of those states, and I've been active in many of those states' processes. And what we found is that when we sit down at the negotiating table and we're drafting negotiations, that it's very often the prisoners who get traded away at the end of the day for other parts of the cannabis ecosystem. And so when we were working on Prop 64 and drafting Prop 64, there was a lot of very robust conversation about retroactive release, about amnesty. It was something that most of us really, really wanted. But there were people in the coalition that was responsible for passing 64 who felt that it would be a poison pill, that if we included that provision in the legislation, that it would make it much more difficult for us to get support, and that it would engender a lot of negative pushback. And so at the end of the day, there was no organization that was dedicated specifically to prisoners sitting at that table. I did the best that I could to advocate, and other people did, but the prisoner part of the cannabis freedom movement just did not have enough voice to be able to overcome, even within our movement, opposition to putting retroactive release into the legislation in the first place, which makes sense, right? If we as a society have decided that something should no longer be illegal, that it's not wrong anymore, then how can you, by any conceivable stretch of the imagination, continue punishing people for something that we have decided should not be illegal anymore, right? So that was the long chain of experience. And then there was this one moment that came to me in 2017, late in the year, as I was in Toronto, Canada, looking for a capital, right? We all expected that the California industry was going to go through this huge growth spurt, and I was involved in cannabis companies in California. So I found myself at the top floor of a very impressive skyscraper in the financial district of Toronto at a very long conference table with some very powerful people. And we had a bunch of spreadsheets on the table. And these spreadsheets envisioned tons and tons and tons of cannabis and hundreds of millions of dollars and vast levels of cannabis operations. And it was a good day, right? Everybody was in a really rosy mood. Everybody thought that all of this was going to happen. People were counting their chickens before they hatched, of course, but the feeling was very good. And of course, nobody in that room had any fear of arrest or anything else. Well, my phone starts buzzing, and I look down because I normally don't take a call in a meeting like that, but it's my buddy Chuck, and he's calling from Pennsylvania, where he's locked up in prison. And so I always take a call from a prisoner, no matter what other kind of meeting I'm in. So I ducked out and I took the call from Chuck, and it was grim, you know, because it's grim talking to your friends, people you love when they're in prison. You hear the metal clanging, you hear the announcements, you hear the pain in their voices, the tension. So I walked back into that conference room with that grimness still clinging to me. But the mood in the room was still really rosy. And I was just struck in that moment between the happiness and the rosiness of the people in that room and the grimness of the situation that my friend Chuck was in. And I knew that I could not continue to participate in the building of a legal industry and not do something to release people like Chuck. And so that was when I decided that I needed to found an organization, which ended up being called the Last Prisoner Project, after the last line in my book, The Cannabis Manifesto.
And as a quick follow-up to that, we have a question from Mitchell Colbert, who is an SSDP alumni. Thank you, Mitchell, for chiming in. I was wondering who exactly were the folks that were calling prison release a poison pill? Like, who was it parents, police, law enforcement officers, the politicians themselves?
Yeah, the perception was at that time was that the California Narcotics Officers Association, that the League of Rural Counties, that the League of Cities, that all of those fairly conservative actors in the political arena would be won over to a position of at least neutrality by Gavin Newsom's support of the initiative. And the feeling within the room, and I don't want to say, you know, which our organizations articulated it, but the feeling within the room full of activists, ultimately at the end of the day, not my feeling, but the feeling that prevailed, was that we would be risking very serious opposition from CNOA, from the rural counties, from the League of Cities, that otherwise we would not see.
It's unfortunate that folks would be against their citizens returning back to those cities, right? Chris, any thoughts on that question specifically? Have you gotten any pushback when it comes to prison release or your work from particular groups like parents or police?
Well, specifically in Maryland, I don't think I've had any pushbacks on releasing of prisoners, but from police, there's always opposition for various reasons. In particular, in Maryland is drug driving. They're worried about. But no, I have I am not aware of opposition in my little circle of this effort. In fact, I think everyone can agree that, especially if we're legalizing, like how can you hold people in jail for something that is now legal? How can you just forget about them? So I think everyone's pretty supportive of the issue, and hopefully they can come out to DC next month.
Yeah. Thankful to the work from folks like Steve. We hopefully are moving past that being a point of contention. But I felt it in Connecticut, right? Like it was definitely one of those things that they didn't want to put on the table. I felt immense pressure from the administration to remove criminal justice completely from the conversation around equity. And we had to fight tooth and nail just to make sure it was included in some way, shape, or form, including that, we're not going to continue to arrest folks for possession, right? We had a whole fight over how much possession is an allowable amount of possession. And can you possess cannabis that is found not in an approved container? Like we had to have a whole fight over whether or not it had to be like specifically cannabis from a purchased location, not that you grew yourself. And lastly, there was intense blowback around home grow. And I found this most shocking because it really was in the public very supported, right? If you had to poll folks of whether or not they supported home grow as part of legalization, it is going to poll far higher than any elected official. And I was told then there's just not the votes for it, right? If you put this in there, it'll kill the whole bill. Well, the governor signed a bill with home grow for patients, and in 2023, home grow for everybody, and it passed. So one of the things I found with these folks is they're lying, right? They're saying that. They will say that until the last day until you win, right? Home grow was impossible until it passed. And I think that's an important point in these different types of concerns that people bring up. A lot of times they're bluffs, right? They sound like they make sense. And so folks go, okay, I guess we have to deal with that. When in reality, you don't, right? You can pick the things that you really want to fight for and make sure it happened. And home grow happened to be one of the ones that, shout out to the Cannon Wars, Cody Roberts and Joe and Lou Vega and Kibra and everybody that fought for home grow in Connecticut, because we defied what the lobbyists said was impossible and got it in the bill. And so, there's definitely always going to be pushback. One additional point of pushback that Adam has asked in the Q&A, and again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. But some folks will say these people committed crimes when they were crimes. And so why should we let folks out that violated the law? They probably almost definitely knew they were violating the law. And why should we let them out now, even though they knew what they were doing when they did it? So maybe we'll start with Steve. Why should folks that committed the crime before now be exonerated?
Well, we're talking about cannabis crimes specifically. We're talking about laws that never should have been passed. They were passed not as matters of public safety or welfare, but you can go back into the legislative record and actually read the language, and you can see that they were passed as methods of racial control. This is true of cannabis bans in the United States, dating from the very first ones, which are 1911, 1912, 1913 in border states bordering Mexico. They were designed to control brown people. You can see it in the earliest state legislations, right? And municipal legislation in places like New Orleans, were designed to control Black people. So the cannabis laws are maybe not uniquely, but are amongst the most unjust laws that have ever been passed in American history. They were entirely based on methods of social control. So, if you think that cannabis prisoners should be locked up, then you probably think it was okay to lock up Nelson Mandela for 30 years for breaking the apartheid laws.
Yeah, Chris?
I don't think I could say it any better than that, honestly. I would just be preaching to the choir at that point. Yeah, people don't belong in jail for a plant. They never did, and they never will. And it, like Steve said, it's been a bogus law. It's been used to target minority groups. It's been used to benefit the prison industrial complex. It's been used for every other reason but public safety and things like that. So I don't like comments like that where, oh, well, you broke the law when it was the law, so you get what you deserve. It should have never been the law to begin with.
And beyond that, if you love cannabis, if you're a cannabis consumer, consider this. In 1969, only 4% of people contacted by the Gallup poll were willing to admit that they had ever consumed cannabis. Today, that figure is above 50%. All of that progress was made by the building of a market for cannabis by legacy operators who broke the law. Okay. Now, you know, until very, very recently, if you got cannabis, you got it because somebody had the courage to carry this healing, enlightening plant through the darkness of prohibition. The people who broke cannabis laws are not criminals. They never were criminals. They're heroes. The criminals are the people who passed these laws and enforce them with such racism and such brutality.
And fast forward to now, you know, the bravery that the White House staff admitted to consuming cannabis and got pushed out. You know, we shouldn't even be afraid to admit that this is part of our lives. You know, we really need to change the conversation. We really need to evolve on this and be accepting of people who consume cannabis. I would love to vote for an elected official that I know goes home and consumes cannabis every day instead of, you know, popping open their prescription pills or going to the bar. I would much rather have somebody in office who's really on our team.
Yeah, and you know, the entire cannabis industry right now is in violation of federal law. So if you're really concerned about violation of federal law, the entire cannabis industry is one giant violation of federal law, right? And all of the tax revenue that comes from the legal industries, that's money laundering, right? So let's lock up all the state legislatures and all the city council folks that are taking those donations, right? The reality is that it was never for justice. And when we imprison people for unjust reasons, they should not remain in prison, right? They should never been there to begin with. But I think the intense hypocrisy of the moment, right? That like that type of question really focuses on a particular type of person and not the ethics of the law itself. And I have found that those folks tend to want to be very punitive in how they approach society and societal change. And that has just been proven not to be an effective strategy. But I do want to shift to a little bit of the conversation of our actual day of action. And Maya, who is a former board chair of SSDP, again, thank you for your service, has a really important question. Is there any concern about the police having a violent reaction when we do our protest in DC, right? We know that we will be violating the law, police will be involved, and police are known to beat people up and, you know, hurt people if not, you know, adequately controlled. And even when we are watching and making sure we're seeing everything that they do, you know, they're very unpredictable. And so when doing an action in a place like DC, there's a lot of federal land, there's a lot of attention. How do you address the concern and the worry that police will overreact and cause harm? And so maybe we'll start with Chris, and maybe done some stuff, then we'll go to Steve.
Well, first I like to just start off by saying that the police here in DC are very experienced with dealing with protests. As long as we keep it civil and nonviolent, we shouldn't have any issues. You know, don't bring any weapons with you. I wouldn't even encourage you to be in possession of any type of drugs while we're doing this action. You know, this isn't a smoke-in. This is to rate, you know, pressure Biden. So like keeping it to the point, like why we're there, remembering why we're there and sticking to the plan will ensure that, you know, the cops aren't going to overreact or, you know, be reactive towards us. You know, they usually know how to handle these types of situations. And as long as we're civil, I don't think we have any of that to worry about.
Steve, thoughts on police violence?
Yeah, I mean, look, as long as we're talking about DC, Chris is absolutely correct. You know, I've been a part of civil disobedience demonstrations in Washington, DC for many decades. It's something that the cops there are used to. It happens all the time. They even have a little box to check at the bottom of the form. Will your demonstration have civil disobedience in it or not? We also know that the cops tend to be better behaved when the spotlight of the media is on them, and there will be an intense media spotlight is on them. We also know the cops tend to behave better when they know that there are lawyers present, and there will be lawyers present. We'll also be providing, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but we'll also be providing training to all the attendees who are planning on getting arrested. And that training is going to involve techniques to mitigate any type of risk of violence. And then, you know, you want to use some good sense, right? So, you know, dress for the occasion. You know that you may be in a jail cell that may be very cold, that may be very hot. So wear layers, make sure that you've got sensitive parts of your bodies that are cushioned. If there's any medications that you need, make sure that you bring those medications and that they are in the prescription jars so that the cops will give you your prescriptions when you need them. But, frankly,
Lock
at
your
the end of
phone
the
up.
day, I'm sorry.
Lock your phone so the cops can't get in it while you're in jail.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason to bring your phone, to bring anything illegal with you in there. I think that all of that will probably be covered in the training. But one of the things that makes civil disobedience effective, one of the reasons that the media covers it, is because there always is a risk. And this is one of those moments where each of us has to decide whether we care enough about what's going on enough to put our bodies between the system that is oppressing our people and our people who are being oppressed and take that risk. And sometimes you just have to do it.
Yeah, and I can tell from experience, I've done it a few different times. We actually blocked the exit to the Senate Hart garage where a lot of folks of staff leave the Senate Hart building. And there was an incredible police presence that showed up immediately. But physically, I wasn't harmed or hurt really, right? With the size of the group does matter as far as like how many people are getting arrested and what the actual outcome will be. The more people that get arrested together, the safer everyone is. Often, if there's a significant number of folks, say 15 to 20 or more, they won't even bring you to the actual jail. They'll bring you to a warehouse where they process you in one big group. And to Steve's point earlier, yes, everyone will have legal support. We'll have a number of lawyers and work with different organizations to provide that support. There will also be non-legal support for the folks in jail, making sure that we're tracking everybody down, you are where you're supposed to be, and that we get everybody out as fast as possible. And I think if you do some research of your own and look at the previous actions that have happened recently in DC, they are relatively rehearsed as far as like how the process goes. And it's true, when we put in the permit for our action, there's literally a box at the bottom that says, will there be civil disobedience? And I think for this particular piece, that tension is what draws the attention of the moment to the space. And the police don't want to sort of help our cause by making a mistake and escalating inappropriately, right? They're going to try to minimize what it is that we're doing. And so I've done 6 different ones. I've never had a really significant negative interaction with the police. And the DC police, of all people, are very sort of predictable in like how they're going to do it. They would even get on a megaphone and say, if you don't want to get arrested, we need you to leave within the next 30 seconds. Here's your first warning, here's your second warning, and then if you remain, you will get arrested. And I've only one time had to actually stay overnight or even close overnight. It was only a few hours in DC jail, and that's when I actually disrupted a vote within Congress, and I was actually in the congressional house. It was when Nancy Pelosi was funding the surge in Iraq, and I disrupted that vote. Even then, I was out by 2 a.m. that night, and that was probably the most extreme action I've ever done. So there is always the case that there's the possibility of it. So that's why we do say, for those that are seriously concerned about that, or that risking arrest would cause them physical or financial burden, then there are other roles in this action for you, right? We really want folks that are able to commit the time and are ready to do this particular type of activism, and we will provide all the legal support and training to make sure you do so in a way that maximizes your safety and maximizes our impact as a group. But again, if you're somebody that has a physical ailment and it may be a little bit risky, you know, we can definitely have you help us with the comms process, or being a legal observer, or helping to move folks around to make sure everybody's where they need to be. There's lots of different things we need in the movement. That being said, though, the number of folks that do join us, the bigger that number is, the safer everyone will be.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we only have about 5 minutes left. And so I do want to give you all a chance to wrap up if you have any final questions. But my final question for you will be, for all the new activists that are watching this for the first time and are considering whether they should do it, you were a young activist once. What type of advice would you give new organizers that this may be their first action as far as going into it, as far as what to expect, or how you think their mindset can be most beneficial? We'll start with Chris, and then we'll start with Steve. And also, if you have any other final thoughts for folks, feel free to let us know. And before I forget, I am dropping some links in the chat as far as being able to sign up for things. If you go to ssdp.org, the first blog post is our pressure biting campaign blog post. You can see where you can sign up there. And you can also reach out to me at jason@ssdp.org, and I'll be happy to connect you and answer any questions you have. But we'll go ahead and start wrapping up here. And we'll start with Chris, and then we will end with Steve.
Yeah, I would say, you know, recruit form your own affinity groups or get involved with ones that already exist. These groups will support one another as we do this action. Start getting involved in politics on a local level, attend town halls, get to know your local elected officials, organize lobby days. At the very least, find a buddy that you can bring and help build the numbers. This is a very strategic time, and Congress and our partial allies that need to be pushed to full support of reform and release of prisoners now.
And I'll just say affinity group organizing is a really fun thing to talk about. Maybe we'll have a call on that, because SSDP chapters are actually the perfect little affinity groups. And so we can figure out the best way to use that particular tactic. But Steve, final thoughts for new activists who want to follow in your footsteps?
Don't miss this opportunity, because it is going to feel so good. The opportunity to actually stand up in a physical way, to directly confront the machine, to do something that we know is going to have impact. So much of activism is just this grind, right? Where we're doing stuff day in and day out, in our position papers and our lobbying and our calls and our meetings. But this is different. This feels different. When you stand up at an action like this and you know that you're putting your body on the line, it's heroic, right? And you feel like a hero, and you are a hero. And life doesn't offer us many opportunities for actions like this that are definite, that are clear, that give us an opportunity to put our values into action in a very meaningful way. So do it, because it's going to feel so fucking good when you do.
And if it's okay, I would like to read a quote by my favorite activist and mentor, Adam Eidinger. He says, this is empowering work and will make you a stronger, more confident person, because once you are no longer afraid to put your body into the machine appears very weak and disorganized compared to you and your allies. Social change is often slow, but each action brings us closer to victory. Don't assume one protest will solve the problem, but sometimes it does. So keep protesting as each action is building upon the last.
Words of wisdom from Brother Adam, for sure.
Yeah, I love it. And I think that's a perfect place to drop there. Again, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Steve. We're going to be mobilizing together. Last Prisoner Project, CMJ, MBMJ, SSDP. Join us on October 24th. If you want more information, jason@ssdp.org. But with that, thank you both, and we'll see you in the streets.
We're so pumped to see you guys.
All right, take care, everybody.